I had always believed that being a mother meant being irreplaceable, until the day I discovered just how replaceable I truly was. What started as a forgotten Mother's Day ended with me making a legal decision that would change everything between us forever. Sometimes the people who know you best are the ones who see you least clearly, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remove yourself from their safety net. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Williams, and I was 58 years old when I learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's convenience. For 33 years, I had been the emergency contact for everyone in my family. Hospital forms, school documents, job applications, insurance papers. My phone number appeared in neat handwriting on countless official documents. I was the person they called when life went sideways, when accidents happened, when crises struck in the middle of the night. I lived in a modest 2-story house in Springfield, Missouri, where the summers were thick with humidity, and the winters bit hard enough to make you appreciate a warm kitchen. The house sat on Maple Street, lined with old oak trees that had watched generations of families come and go. My neighbors were the kind of people who still waved from their front porches and borrowed cups of sugar without embarrassment. It was the sort of neighborhood where children's bicycles lay forgotten on sidewalks and the ice cream truck's tinny melody could summon a dozen kids from air-conditioned houses within minutes. For the past 15 years, I had worked as a school librarian at Jefferson Elementary, just 3 miles from home. It wasn't glamorous work, but it filled me with a quiet satisfaction that few people understood. Every morning, I unlocked the heavy wooden doors to the library and breathed in the familiar scent of old books and fresh possibilities. Children would stream in throughout the day, some hunting for adventure stories, others needing help with research projects, and a few who simply wanted a quiet place to exist for a while. I loved the rhythm of it all, the soft shuffle of small feet across worn carpet, the whispered conversations between friends discovering new books, the satisfying thunk of returned volumes being sorted back into their proper places. During lunch breaks, I would sit at my desk with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through tall windows. It was peaceful work, predictable work, and after decades of chaos and urgency that came with raising 3 children, I had learned to treasure predictability. My children, Michael, Jennifer, and David, were all adults now, scattered across different states like seeds blown from a dandelion. Michael, my eldest at 33, lived in Denver with his wife Amanda and their twin boys. He worked in corporate finance, the kind of job that required expensive suits and early morning flights to cities I had never visited. Jennifer, 30, had settled in Portland with her boyfriend Marcus. She taught yoga and sold handmade jewelry at local farmers markets, embracing a lifestyle that seemed to change with the seasons. David, my youngest at 28, lived closest to home in Kansas City, working as a software engineer for a company whose name I could never quite remember. Despite the distance, or perhaps because of it, I had worked hard to maintain the threads that connected us. Weekly phone calls that I initiated, birthday cards sent with checks tucked inside, care packages shipped during final exams or stressful work periods. I remembered their friends' names, their favorite foods, the small details that showed I was paying attention to their lives even from hundreds of miles away. My husband Robert had passed away 6 years earlier, leaving me to navigate the strange territory of widowhood alone. We had been married for 28 years, and his absence still caught me off guard sometimes, reaching for his coffee mug in the morning, turning to share a joke that only he would understand, saving newspaper articles I thought might interest him before remembering he wasn't there to read them. The grief had softened over time, transforming from sharp, breathless pain into something more manageable, like a weight I had learned to carry without stumbling. After Robert's death, my role as the family's emergency contact had become even more important. I was the one they called when Jennifer's car broke down on a rainy highway outside of Portland. I was the one who flew to Denver when Michael's wife had complications during the twins' delivery. I was the one who drove to Kansas City when David needed someone to help him move into a new apartment after a difficult breakup. I answered every call, caught every midnight flight, dropped everything whenever they needed me. Nakasatika. It had always been this way, even when they were children. I was the mother who volunteered for every field trip, who stayed up late helping with science projects, who attended every soccer game and piano recital. Robert used to joke that I had radar for our children's needs, that I could sense trouble or triumph from 3 rooms away. Perhaps I had been too available, too eager to solve their problems, but it had felt like love at the time. It had felt necessary. The house on Maple Street reflected this history of constant availability. The refrigerator was covered with photographs held by mismatched magnets, graduation pictures, vacation snapshots, holiday gatherings from years past. The guest bedrooms remained perpetually ready, with fresh sheets and towels, just in case someone needed to come home unexpectedly. The freezer stayed stocked with the kinds of food my children had loved as teenagers, as if they might arrive hungry and 18 years old again at any moment. My daily routine had settled into a comfortable pattern since retirement. Morning coffee on the back porch, tending to the small vegetable garden Robert had started, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evenings spent reading or working on the quilts I donated to the local women's shelter. Weekends meant grocery shopping, house cleaning, and long phone conversations with old friends who were navigating their own versions of empty nest syndrome. But underneath this peaceful exterior, something had been shifting for months, though I couldn't quite name it yet. It was in the way my children's phone calls had become shorter, more perfunctory. It was in the way they seemed surprised when I mentioned details from previous conversations, as if they hadn't expected me to remember or hadn't expected those details to matter to me. It was in the way they increasingly treated me like a resource to be accessed when needed, rather than a person with her own thoughts, dreams, and disappointments. I had begun to notice how often our conversations centered around what I could do for them. Could I send money for Jennifer's car repair? Could I help research preschools for Michael's twins? Could I call David's landlord about his security deposit? The conversations rarely turned to my own life, my own challenges, my own small victories and defeats. When they did ask about me, it felt obligatory, like checking a box on a list of social requirements. Still, I told myself this was normal, even healthy. Wasn't this what successful parenting looked like? Raising children who were independent enough to build their own lives? Confident enough to pursue their own dreams? I had done my job well, perhaps too well. They no longer needed me in the daily, consuming way they once had, and I should have been proud of that achievement. But as Mother's Day approached that year, I found myself hoping for something more than duty, more than obligation. I wanted to feel seen, valued, remembered, not just as an emergency contact or a source of practical help, but as a person who had shaped their lives in ways both large and small. I wanted to feel like I mattered to them the way they had always mattered to me. Spring had arrived early in Springfield that year, painting the neighborhood in fresh shades of green and pink. The dogwood trees outside my kitchen window were heavy with blooms, and the air carried the sweet promise of warmer days ahead. As I watered the tomato seedlings on my back porch that morning, I allowed myself to imagine the phone calls that would come, the plans that might be made, the ways my children might choose to honor the woman who had spent decades putting their needs before her own. I had no idea that Mother's Day would come and go like any other Sunday, leaving me invisible in my own children's lives, or that this oversight would become the catalyst for the most important decision I had made in years. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest disappointments. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop being available to catch them every time they fall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first hint that something was different came on a Tuesday morning in late April, 3 weeks before Mother's Day. I was reorganizing the linen closet, one of those mindless spring cleaning tasks that helped me think, when my phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. Usually her messages were long and chatty, filled with details about her latest yoga workshop or a new recipe she'd discovered at the farmer's market. This one was different. "Hey Mom, quick question. Do you have Aunt Carol's address? Need it for something. Thanks." I stared at the message for a moment, puzzled. Carol was my sister, Robert's only sibling, and Jennifer had visited her countless times over the years. They exchanged Christmas cards, birthday wishes, and occasional phone calls. Why wouldn't Jennifer have her address? I typed back Carol's information, adding a casual, "Everything okay?" but received only a thumbs-up emoji in response. It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing, but it lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Jennifer had always been the most communicative of my children, the one who would call just to share random thoughts or ask my opinion on everything from apartment decor to relationship advice. The brevity felt foreign, almost transactional. 2 days later, Michael called during his lunch break, which was unusual in itself. His calls typically came in the evenings, after the twins were in bed, and he had a moment to breathe. But there he was at noon on a Thursday, asking if I still had the name of the pediatrician who had treated him for asthma when he was 7. "Dr. Henderson retired years ago," I told him, cradling the phone between my shoulder and ear while I folded a basket of laundry. "Why do you need that information?" "Oh, just updating some medical history forms," he said quickly. "Amanda's been organizing all our paperwork, you know how she is." I did know how Amanda was. Meticulous. Organized. The type of person who color-coded their calendar and kept digital copies of everything important. It seemed odd that she would need a decades-old pediatrician's name for any current purpose. But Michael's voice carried that rushed quality that meant he was already thinking about his next meeting. "Is everything all right with the boys?" I asked. "Any health concerns I should know about?" No, everyone's fine, just being thorough. I should get back to work, but thanks, Mom. Love you." The call ended before I could respond, leaving me standing in my living room with a half-folded towel in my hands and an uncomfortable feeling in my chest. Michael had always been brief on the phone. Even as a child, he'd treated telephone conversations like necessary evils to be completed as efficiently as possible. But this felt different somehow, like he was checking items off a list rather than talking to his mother. That weekend, David drove down from Kansas City for what he said was a, quote, quick visit. He arrived Saturday afternoon with a duffel bag and a distracted energy that made him seem like he was already halfway out the door. We grilled burgers on the back patio and talked about his work, his latest hiking adventures, the new coffee shop that had opened near his apartment. Normal topics, normal conversation, but something felt slightly off-kilter. It wasn't until Sunday morning, as he was loading his bag back into his car, that he mentioned the real reason for his visit. "Mom, I need to update some paperwork at work," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Health insurance stuff, beneficiary forms, that kind of thing. I might need to call you later this week to verify some information." "Of course," I said, hugging him goodbye. "You know you can call me anytime." As I watched his car disappear down Maple Street, I realized that all 3 of my children had contacted me within the span of a week, asking for information they should have already had. Addresses, medical history, personal details, the kind of information that gets requested when you're filling out comprehensive forms or updating important documents. The thought followed me through the rest of Sunday and into the following week. During my morning walks, I found myself trying to piece together what kind of paperwork would require such a variety of old information. Insurance forms, maybe, or legal documents of some kind. Perhaps they were all updating their wills or life insurance policies, though that seemed like an odd coincidence. On Wednesday evening, I was watering the hanging baskets on my front porch when Mrs. Chen from across the street waved me over to the fence that separated our yards. Eleanor Chen was 73 years old, a retired teacher who had moved to the neighborhood the same year Robert and I did. She had a talent for gentle gossip and a genuine concern for everyone on the block. "Patricia, dear, I hope you don't mind my asking," she said, lowering her voice, even though we were the only people outside. "But is everything all right with your family? I've noticed you've seemed a bit thoughtful lately." Eleanor had the kind of observational skills that came from decades of managing classrooms full of children. She noticed things: when someone's routine changed, when a neighbor seemed troubled, when the usual patterns of life shifted in ways that might seem insignificant to others. "I'm fine," I assured her, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was entirely true. "Just spring cleaning, you know how it is. Getting organized." She nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, if you ever want to talk, You know where to find me. Sometimes it helps to say things out loud, even when they seem silly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and actually tried to catalog what had been bothering me. The requests for information, the brief phone calls, David's unexpected visit that felt more like a fact-finding mission than a social call. Individually, each incident could be explained away easily. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't quite identify but couldn't ignore either. I pulled out the small notebook I kept by the phone, the one where I jotted down grocery lists and appointment reminders, and started writing down the timeline of recent interactions with my children. Michael's call about Dr. Henderson on Thursday, Jennifer's text about Aunt Carol's address on Tuesday, David's visit and mention of work paperwork over the weekend. When I saw it all laid out in my careful handwriting, the pattern became clearer, though no less puzzling. They were updating something, all of them, and that something required information about our family history, my contact details, and possibly my relationship to each of them. The most logical explanation was that they were all dealing with some kind of legal or financial paperwork that required family information. Estate planning, perhaps, or insurance updates. But why wouldn't they just tell me that? Why the secretive individual calls and visits instead of a simple family conversation about whatever they were working on? The following Thursday, exactly a week after Michael's call about the pediatrician, Jennifer called during her lunch break. This was also unusual. Jennifer typically called in the evenings while she was cooking dinner or taking a bath, times when she could multitask and chat for an hour or more. "Hi, Mom, I have a quick question," she said, and I could hear traffic in the background, suggesting she was walking somewhere during her break. "Do you remember the name of my high school guidance counselor? I'm trying to remember for something I'm working on." "Mrs. Rodriguez," I answered immediately. "Maria Rodriguez. She was wonderful, remember? She helped you with your college applications." "Right, Mrs. Rodriguez. And she's probably retired by now, right?" "I would imagine so. That was over 10 years ago." "Is everything okay, honey? This is the second time this month you've asked me for old contact information." There was a pause, filled with the sound of car horns and footsteps on pavement. "Oh, it's nothing major, just some personal project I'm working on." "Thanks, Mom. I should get back to work." Another brief call, another vague explanation, another piece of old information requested and quickly obtained. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the library, helping third graders find books about butterflies and trying not to read too much into what was probably nothing more than a series of coincidences. But that evening, as I tended to my vegetable garden in the fading light, I couldn't shake the feeling that my children were gathering information about me, about our family, about our shared history. It felt like they were conducting some kind of quiet inventory, cataloging details they might need for something they weren't ready to discuss. The tomato plants were thriving in the warm spring weather, already showing tiny green fruits that promised a summer harvest. I staked the taller plants and tied their stems with soft cloth strips, thinking about growth and support, and the ways we nurture the things we want to see flourish. As I worked, I tried to convince myself that whatever my children were planning or updating or organizing, it came from a place of responsibility rather than concern. They were adults now, taking care of important paperwork, being proactive about their financial and legal affairs. But deep down, a small voice whispered that responsible adult children usually kept their mothers informed about major life changes, especially ones that required detailed family information. Responsible adult children didn't make their mothers feel like they were being quietly studied and cataloged without explanation. As I gathered my gardening tools and headed back into the house, I made a mental note to pay closer attention to future conversations. Maybe I was imagining things, reading too much into innocent requests for information. Maybe my children were simply being efficient, handling necessary paperwork without wanting to burden me with the details. Or maybe something was happening that I didn't understand yet, something that required them to have comprehensive information about their mother and their family history. Something they weren't quite ready to share. Either way, I decided, I would be ready for whatever came next. I would pay attention, ask better questions, and trust my instincts even when they seemed to be leading me toward uncomfortable possibilities. Sometimes a mother's intuition is the only early warning system we have, and mine was definitely trying to tell me something important. The breakthrough came the following Tuesday morning while I was standing in line at Ferguson's hardware store, waiting to buy mulch for my flower beds. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but the woman ahead of me was speaking loudly enough into her phone that privacy wasn't really an option. "Yes, I understand the forms need to be notarized," she was saying, shifting a bag of grass seed from one arm to the other. "But I'm telling you, my mother doesn't know anything about this yet. We want to have everything ready before we sit her down and explain the situation." The conversation continued as she paid for her purchases, something about power of attorney documents and medical directives. I found myself studying her face as she talked. She looked to be around Jennifer's age, with worry lines etched around her eyes, and the kind of determined expression that comes with making difficult family decisions. After she left, I stood there holding my receipt for mulch, feeling like I'd been given a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Power of attorney. Medical directives. Legal documents that required detailed family information and needed to be prepared in secret before difficult conversations with aging parents. My hands were shaking slightly as I loaded the bags of mulch into my trunk. The woman in the hardware store was dealing with an entirely different family situation, I told myself. Her conversation had nothing to do with my children's recent behavior, but the coincidence felt too sharp to ignore, especially when combined with all the strange requests for old addresses and medical information. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Carol without any particular reason or news to share. We lived only 2 hours apart, but our conversations had become sporadic since Robert's death, limited mostly to holidays and family emergencies. "Patricia!" Carol's voice was warm with surprise. "What a lovely unexpected call. How are you doing, honey?" We chatted about the weather, her garden, my recent retirement activities. Then, trying to sound casual, I mentioned that Jennifer had asked for Carol's address a couple of weeks earlier. "Oh yes, she called me directly about that," Carol said. "Sweet girl. She wanted to make sure she had my current information for some kind of family contact list she was putting together." My stomach dropped. "She called you directly?" "Just last week. She said she was updating emergency contact information for herself and wanted to make sure she had everyone's current details. Very responsible of her, I thought. She asked about my health, whether I had any medical conditions they should know about, that sort of thing." I gripped the phone tighter. "Did she say why she needed that information?" "Not specifically, but I assumed it was just good planning. You know how organized young people are these days with all their digital systems? She probably has spreadsheets for everything." Carol laughed, but something in my silence must have alerted her because her tone shifted. "Patricia, is everything all right? You sound concerned." "I'm sure it's nothing," I said quickly. "I was just curious." But after we hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, feeling pieces of understanding click together in ways I didn't like. Jennifer hadn't just asked me for Carol's address. She had contacted Carol directly to gather medical information and verify contact details. This wasn't casual organization or updating personal records. This was systematic information gathering. I spent the rest of the week paying closer attention to everything my children said and didn't say. When Michael called on Friday to chat about the twins' upcoming soccer season, I listened for undertones and watched for verbal cues like I was conducting an investigation. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked at one point, and the question struck me as oddly specific. Not "how are you doing" or "what's new," but "how are you feeling?" Boom, you sighed, Jerome, the kind of question you ask when you're monitoring someone's health status. "I'm feeling fine," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "No reason, just making sure you're taking care of yourself. You know, at your age, it's important to stay on top of things. At my age." The phrase hung in the air between us like a small accusation. I was 58 years old, not 88. I worked out 3 times a week at the community center, hiked the nature trails behind my house every weekend, and had more energy now than I'd had in years. When exactly had I crossed some invisible line into the category of people who needed to be monitored and managed? "Michael," I said slowly, "is there something you want to ask me? Something specific you're worried about?" There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "No, Mom, not at all. I just want to make sure you're happy and healthy. That's all." But it wasn't all. I could hear it in the careful way he chose his words, in the slight defensiveness that crept into his voice when I pressed for details. He was protecting something, hiding something, and apparently, my own well-being was at the center of whatever they were protecting me from. The following Monday, David made his second, unexpected trip to Springfield in 3 weeks. This time, he brought his laptop and spent most of Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table, ostensibly working on a project for his software company, but I noticed him glancing around the house frequently, his eyes cataloging details like he was seeing the place for the first time. "Mom, have you thought about updating your will lately?" he asked during dinner, cutting into his pork chop with deliberate focus on his plate. The question was so direct, so far removed from our usual conversations about his work and social life, that I nearly choked on my water. "My will? Just wondering. Dad's been gone for 6 years now, and sometimes people forget to update important documents after major life changes." I set down my fork and studied his face. David had always been the most straightforward of my children, the least likely to dance around difficult topics. If he was asking about my will, there was a specific reason. "David, what's going on? This is the second time in a month you've driven down here, and now you're asking about legal documents. Are you worried about something?" He looked up from his plate, and for a moment I saw a flash of something that might have been guilt or anxiety. "I'm not worried exactly. I just think it's smart to have things in order, that's all. You're living alone now, and we want to make sure..." "Make sure what?" "That you're protected. That your wishes are documented. That we know what you want if something happens." The phrase, "if something happens," settled over the dinner table like a cold draft. I had been a widow for 6 years, living independently, managing my own finances, making my own decisions. Nothing had changed recently in my health, my circumstances, or my capabilities. So why were my children suddenly concerned about protecting me and documenting my wishes? "Bye, Ellen. Has someone said something to you about my health?" I asked directly. "Have you noticed something I haven't?" "No, nothing like that." David's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "We just love you, and we want to be prepared." That night, after David had gone to bed in the guest room, I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what being prepared meant in the context of my apparently unchanged life. I thought about the woman at the hardware store, preparing legal documents before having difficult conversations with her mother. I thought about my children's systematic gathering of family information, their sudden interest in my medical history and personal wishes. The most logical explanation was that they suspected something was wrong with me, something serious enough to warrant legal preparation, but not serious enough to discuss directly. Maybe they had noticed changes I hadn't seen, signs of aging or declining health that were obvious to them but invisible to me. I got up and walked to the bathroom, turning on the light and studying my reflection in the mirror. The same face I saw every morning looked back at me, older than I sometimes felt, with gray threading through brown hair and lines that mapped decades of laughter and worry. But nothing that suggested illness or incapacity. Nothing that would warrant emergency contact updates and will discussions. Unless they weren't preparing for something that was happening to me. Unless they were preparing for something they were planning to do. The thought hit me like cold water, sudden and shocking. What if this wasn't about my health, or my aging, or my well-being? What if this was about their lives, their convenience, their need to have certain legal and practical matters settled before they made changes that would affect our family dynamic? I thought about Michael's demanding job, the travel and pressure that made family obligations feel burdensome. I thought about Jennifer's free-spirited lifestyle in Portland, her resistance to traditional responsibilities. I thought about David's increasing involvement in his own social circle, his casual mentions of friends and activities that filled his weekends. What if they were preparing to step back from their roles as my primary support system? What if they were updating emergency contacts and gathering family information because they were planning to transfer responsibility for my care to someone else? A professional service, a care facility, a system that would relieve them of the obligation to be available when I needed them. The possibility made my chest tight with something that felt like panic mixed with betrayal. I was 58 years old, healthy, independent, and perfectly capable of managing my own life. I didn't need care or supervision or management. But maybe they had decided I did. Or maybe they had decided they no longer wanted to be the people I called when life got complicated. I walked back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle around me and trying to breathe normally. In the guest room down the hall, David slept peacefully, probably dreaming about algorithms and code, rather than the questions his visit had raised. Tomorrow, he would drive back to Kansas City with whatever information he had come to gather, and I would be left alone with my growing certainty that my children were making plans about my future without including me in the conversation. The realization that they might be preparing to move me out of their daily lives felt worse than any health scare could have. At least illness would be something happening to me rather than something being done to me. At least aging would be a natural process rather than a calculated decision. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. If my children were making plans about my future, they were about to discover that I was still perfectly capable of making plans of my own. The truth came to me not through careful detective work or dramatic confrontation, but through a misdirected email that arrived on Mother's Day morning at 7:23 a.m. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, still in my robe, watching cardinals flutter around the bird feeder outside my window. My laptop was open beside me, a habit I'd developed since retirement, checking email while I eased into the day. The subject line read, "Final draft, emergency contact changes. Please review before Monday." The sender was Michael's email address, but when I opened it, I realized immediately that it hadn't been meant for me. The message was addressed to Jennifer and David, with detailed instructions about a conference call scheduled for later that day to, quote, finalize the transition plan. My hands went cold as I read the attached document. It was a comprehensive spreadsheet titled Patricia Williams, Contact Transfer Protocol. Every institution in my life was listed. My bank, my insurance companies, my doctor's office, the veterinarian who treated my neighbor's cat when I pet sat, even my subscription services and utility providers. Next to each entry were detailed notes about how to update my emergency contact information, transferring their role as my primary contacts to something called Sunset Manor Adult Living Community. I scrolled down through pages of meticulous planning. They had researched monthly costs, toured facilities, and apparently selected a, quote, premium assisted living community in Kansas City. David's proximity to the facility was noted as a key advantage. There were floor plans attached, showing a one-bedroom apartment with a small kitchenette and bathroom. The marketing materials emphasized independence with support and peace of mind for families. But it was the final section of the document that made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. Under the heading Timeline and Transition Strategy, they had outlined their plan in clinical detail. Phase 1. Completed. Gather all necessary documentation and contact information. Update our own records to reflect new arrangements. Phase 2. Mother's Day weekend. Emotional preparation conversation. Present the move as a positive choice for mom's safety and social enrichment. Phase 3. Following week. Begin official contact transfers. Schedule facility tour and move-in date. Phase 4. June 1st target. Physical relocation. Professional moving service has been contacted. Also, I read the timeline 3 times before the full impact hit me. They weren't just planning to change my emergency contacts. They were planning to move me into assisted living. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. And they had chosen Mother's Day as the day to tell me about the decision they had already made on my behalf. And yet the coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I didn't notice. I was too busy reading through the additional attachments. Power of attorney documents prepared by a lawyer in Denver. Medical records requests they had submitted to my doctor's office. And a detailed financial analysis of my assets that included selling my house to fund the assisted living arrangement. They had been planning this for months. Every strange phone call, every request for information, every unexpected visit had been part of an elaborate data-gathering operation designed to prepare for my involuntary relocation. They had treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. The email included a group text thread that had apparently been copied into the document by mistake. Reading through their messages felt like watching my life being dissected by strangers. Michael called Dr. Peterson's office yesterday. They said Mom seems physically fine but mentioned she's been asking about memory supplements. Could be early signs. Jennifer, that's normal aging stuff, not dementia. But it supports our case that she needs monitoring. David, Sunset Manor has a great activities program. She'll make friends. It's honestly better than sitting alone in that big house. Michael, the important thing is presenting this as our concern for her happiness, not our need for convenience. Jennifer, agreed. We emphasize safety and socialization. Make it sound like an adventure. David, I'll handle the financial stuff with the house sale. We can set up a trust so she doesn't have to worry about money management. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, feeling like I was reading about someone else's life. They had constructed an entire narrative about my needs, my safety, my happiness, and my future, without once asking me what I actually wanted. They had convinced themselves that their plan was motivated by love and concern, while simultaneously dismissing my autonomy and intelligence. The reference to memory supplements was particularly galling. I had asked Dr. Peterson about cognitive health during my last annual checkup, not because I was experiencing problems, but because I was being proactive about aging. Apparently, my children had interpreted this as evidence of declining mental capacity rather than responsible self-care. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Can't wait to see you this afternoon. We have something special planned. Red heart. Something special. The emotional preparation conversation outlined in their timeline. They were coming here today to tell me about their decision, probably expecting gratitude for their thoughtful planning and concern for my well-being. I closed the laptop and walked to my living room, sinking into the armchair where I had spent countless evenings reading and thinking since Robert's death. The house was quiet around me, filled with 40 years of memories and choices. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every small decorative object reflected decisions I had made about how I wanted to live. This was my space, my sanctuary, my carefully cultivated life. They wanted to strip all of that away and replace it with a one-bedroom apartment in an institution designed for people who couldn't manage their own lives. They wanted to sell my house, the house where I had raised them, where Robert and I had shared decades of ordinary miracles, where I had built a life that still brought me joy and purpose. The cruelest part was their assumption that I was lonely and isolated. Yes, I lived alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had my work at the library, my neighbors, my garden, my routines that anchored me to a life I had chosen. I had independence and privacy, and the freedom to make my own decisions about everything from what to eat for dinner to how to spend my weekends. But they had decided that independence was too risky for someone my age, that privacy was just another word for isolation, and that my freedom to make choices was less important than their peace of mind about my safety. I thought about Mrs. Chen across the street, who was 15 years older than me and still living independently. I thought about the other librarians I knew who were working well into their 70s by choice. I thought about all the vibrant, capable women my age who would be horrified at the suggestion that turning 58 meant surrendering control of their lives to their adult children. Around noon, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the front window, I watched all 3 of my children emerge from separate vehicles, gathering on my front lawn like they were steeling themselves for a difficult mission. Michael carried a bouquet of flowers, Jennifer held what looked like a wrapped gift, and David had a folder tucked under his arm, probably containing brochures and promotional materials for Sunset Manor. They looked nervous, exchanging glances and quiet words before walking toward my front door. I realized they were probably dreading this conversation almost as much as I was, but for entirely different reasons. They were worried about my reaction to their carefully planned surprise. I was devastated by their complete dismissal of my agency and judgment. The doorbell rang, followed by Jennifer's cheerful voice calling Happy Mother's Day through the door. I sat in my chair for a long moment, staring at the laptop that contained the evidence of their betrayal, trying to decide how to handle what was about to unfold. I could pretend I hadn't seen the email, let them go through their prepared presentation, act surprised by their announcement. I could express appropriate gratitude for their concern, while privately planning my resistance. I could play the role they expected, the aging mother who needed guidance and protection from her wise adult children. Or I could walk to that door with full knowledge of their plan and confront them with the truth. That they had violated my trust, dismissed my competence, and made life-altering decisions about my future without including me in the conversation. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. I stood up slowly, smoothing my robe and running my fingers through my uncombed hair. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine the future of my relationship with my children, and the trajectory of the rest of my life. As I walked toward the front door, one thought crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. They were about to discover that the woman they thought needed their protection and management was still perfectly capable of fighting for herself. I reached for the doorknob, took a deep breath, and prepared to have the most important conversation of my life. I opened the door to find my 3 children standing on my front porch, wearing identical expressions of forced cheerfulness, like actors preparing for a difficult scene. The morning sun cast long shadows behind them, and for a moment, I saw them not as my beloved children but as strangers who had spent months plotting against me. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom." Jennifer stepped forward first, her smile too bright, her hug lasting a beat too long. The wrapped gift in her hands felt like a prop in whatever performance they had rehearsed. Michael presented the bouquet with the awkward formality of someone fulfilling an obligation. "We thought we'd spend the whole day with you," he said, and the words carried weight that had nothing to do with celebration. David hung back slightly, clutching his folder, his eyes scanning my face, as if looking for signs of the decline they had convinced themselves they were seeing. "We have some things we'd like to talk about," he said carefully. I stepped aside to let them in, my silence apparently striking them as typical Mother's Day emotion rather than the careful control it actually was. They filed into my living room, arranging themselves on the furniture with the deliberate positioning of people about to deliver rehearsed news. My laptop still sat open on the kitchen table, the evidence of their conspiracy glowing on the screen just 20 feet away. I thought about walking over and reading their own words aloud, confronting them immediately with what I had discovered. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity about how they planned to present their betrayal as love. "Mom, sit down." Jennifer patted the cushion beside her on the couch. "We have something wonderful to tell you." "Wonderful." I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap, watching their faces as they prepared to destroy my life while calling it a gift. Michael cleared his throat. "We've been talking as a family and we're all concerned about you living alone in this big house. It's not that there's anything wrong," David added quickly, consulting notes he had apparently prepared. "You're healthy and independent, but we want to make sure you stay that way." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "We found this amazing place in Kansas City, close to David. It's called Sunset Manor, and it's specifically designed for people who want to maintain their independence while having support available." They tag-teamed through their presentation, like a well-coordinated sales team. Michael talked about safety features and emergency response systems. David described the activities program and social opportunities. Jennifer rhapsodized about the freedom from home maintenance and the peace of mind they would all feel. I sat through it all without speaking, watching them perform this elaborate charade of concern while my heart broke piece by piece. They had reduced my entire life to a series of problems that needed solving. The house was too big, the neighborhood too quiet, my social circle too small. They spoke about me as if I were already diminished, already incapable of recognizing what was best for myself. "We've already put down a deposit," Michael said, pulling papers from David's folder. "The apartment is beautiful, Mom. You'll have your own kitchen, your own space, but with people around if you need anything." "We can schedule a tour for next week," Jennifer added. "Once you see it, you'll understand why we're so excited." David leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "The best part is, you won't have to worry about managing the house anymore. We can handle the sale, set up a trust fund with the proceeds. You'll never have to think about bills or maintenance or any of that stressful stuff again. Never have to think, never have to worry, never have to manage my own life because they had decided I was no longer capable of doing so." "What do you think, Mom?" Jennifer's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Isn't it perfect?" I looked at their faces. Michael's determined practicality, Jennifer's misguided enthusiasm, David's cautious optimism. These were the children I had raised, loved, sacrificed for, and protected. These were the people I had called in every crisis, celebrated with in every triumph, supported through every challenge. And they were sitting in my living room, in the house where I had nurtured them, telling me that my life as I knew it was over. Something broke inside me then, not dramatically but quietly, like a thread that has been pulled too tight for too long. The careful control I had maintained since reading their email crumbled, and suddenly I was sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. "Mom!" Jennifer reached for me immediately. "What's wrong? We thought you'd be happy." But I couldn't stop crying long enough to answer. Months of suppressed confusion, weeks of growing suspicion, and hours of devastating revelation poured out of me in waves. I cried for the trust they had broken, for the future they had planned without me, for the mother they had decided I was no longer capable of being. Michael looked panicked. "Mom, please tell us what's wrong. Are you feeling okay?" The question only made me cry harder. Was I feeling okay? Was I mentally competent? Was I still the person they remembered? Or had I already transformed in their minds into someone who needed their management and protection? I saw. I tried to speak through the tears, but the words wouldn't come. How do you tell your children that you've discovered their elaborate plot to control your life? How do you explain that their love feels like betrayal when it comes wrapped in deception? David exchanged worried glances with his siblings. "Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson," he said quietly. "This seems like an extreme reaction." An extreme reaction. Of course it did. In their minds, any response other than grateful acceptance would be evidence of the decline they had already convinced themselves they were seeing. My tears weren't the natural response of a woman whose autonomy had been violated. They were symptoms of instability that justified their intervention. "No," I managed to choke out. "No doctors." I wiped my eyes with the tissues Jennifer pressed into my hands and tried to pull myself together. They were watching me with the careful attention of people monitoring a volatile situation, ready to interpret my every word and gesture as evidence supporting their predetermined conclusion. "Mom," Jennifer's voice was patient, the tone you might use with a confused child. "We know this is a big change. It's natural to feel overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Not betrayed, not violated, not infantilized. Overwhelmed, as if their plan was simply too generous for me to process properly. "We're not trying to rush you," Michael said, though I knew from their timeline that they had already scheduled the move for June 1st. "Take all the time you need to get used to the idea." But they weren't giving me time to get used to an idea. They were giving me time to accept a decision they had already made. The deposit was paid, the apartment reserved, the moving company contacted. My house would be sold, my emergency contacts transferred, my life completely reorganized according to their vision of what was best for me. I looked around my living room, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. To them, it was probably too big, too isolated, too full of memories that kept me anchored to the past. They saw maintenance issues and safety concerns where I saw home. They saw loneliness where I saw solitude. They saw decline where I saw the natural evolution of a life well lived. "I need some time alone," I said finally, my voice hoarse from crying. They exchanged more concerned glances. "Maybe we should stay," David said, "just to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I insisted, though we all knew that wasn't true. "I just need to process this." Jennifer squeezed my hand. "We love you so much, Mom. Everything we're doing is because we love you." I nodded because I believed that was true, which somehow made it worse. They did love me, in their way, but their love had become possessive, controlling, based on their fears rather than my reality. They loved the mother they remembered, not the woman I actually was. After they left, promising to call later and check on me, I sat in my empty house feeling more alone than I had ever felt, even in the darkest days after Robert's death. At least then, my children had been my allies, supporting me through grief and helping me rebuild my life. Now they had become the architects of my dismantling. I walked to the kitchen and stared at my laptop screen, reading through their messages again with fresh eyes. They had psychoanalyzed every conversation, interpreted every pause, cataloged every sign of aging as evidence supporting their case. They had turned my life into a problem that needed solving, rather than a story that was still being written. The house felt different now, tainted by their assessment of it as too big, too dangerous, too much for someone like me to handle. Every creaking floorboard, every steep stair, every room I had to walk through to reach another, suddenly seemed like evidence against my competence. They had poisoned my sanctuary with their fears. I thought about the one-bedroom apartment they had selected for me, with its kitchenette and bathroom and carefully planned common areas designed to combat the isolation they assumed I was experiencing. I thought about the activities director who would plan my days, the meal service that would eliminate my need to cook, the emergency button that would summon help whenever they deemed it necessary. It wasn't a home they were offering me. It was supervised independence, freedom with training wheels, a life carefully circumscribed by other people's assessment of my capabilities. As the afternoon stretched on and my tears finally subsided, a new feeling began to emerge from the wreckage of my trust and love. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. It wasn't hurt, though I was devastated. It was something colder, more determined. If my children wanted to treat me like someone who couldn't manage her own life, then perhaps it was time to show them exactly how capable I still was. If they wanted to make decisions about my future without consulting me, then perhaps it was time to make some decisions of my own. They had planned my life around their convenience and their peace of mind. Now it was time for me to plan my life around something else entirely. My own dignity, my own choices, and my own vision of what the rest of my story should look like. The woman they thought needed their protection was about to remind them that she was still perfectly capable of protecting herself. The turning point came at 3:47 a.m. on Monday morning, exactly 18 hours after my children had left my house believing they had given me the gift of a managed future. I had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me. The soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the oak trees outside my bedroom window. These were the sounds they wanted to take away from me. These quiet, unremarkable moments of belonging somewhere, of being home in a space I had created and maintained and loved. In their vision of my future, I would fall asleep to the sounds of other people's televisions through thin walls, wake up to institutional lighting and scheduled activities, live according to rhythms determined by someone else's assessment of what was appropriate for a woman my age. I got up and walked through my house in the darkness, not bothering to turn on lights. I knew every corner, every piece of furniture, every potential obstacle by heart. This was my space, learned and earned through decades of living. I moved through it with the confidence of absolute familiarity, something they apparently couldn't see or chose not to value. In the kitchen, I made coffee and sat at the table where I had read their betrayal just 24 hours earlier. The laptop was closed now, but I could feel the weight of their plans pressing down on me like a physical presence. By their timeline, I had less than 3 weeks before they expected me to submit to their carefully orchestrated future. But as I sat there in the pre-dawn quiet, something crystallized in my mind with startling clarity. They had made one crucial miscalculation. They had planned every detail of my relocation, researched every aspect of assisted living, prepared every legal document they thought they needed. But they had forgotten one essential element: my consent. I was not incompetent. I had not been declared mentally unfit. I had not signed power of attorney documents or requested their intervention in my life. They could make all the plans they wanted, but they could not force me to cooperate with my own displacement. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I had power in this situation. Even if they had tried to convince me otherwise, I had choices, even if they had attempted to present their plan as inevitable. Most importantly, I had agency, even though they had spent months treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be consulted. But having power and knowing how to use it were two different things entirely. If I simply refused their plan, they would likely interpret my resistance as further evidence of declining judgment. They might pursue legal avenues to override my objections, armed with their carefully documented concerns about my well-being. They might escalate their intervention, bringing in doctors and lawyers and social workers to evaluate my competence. I needed to do more than resist their plan. I needed to demonstrate unequivocally that I was still the author of my own life. I needed to show them that the woman they thought required their management was perfectly capable of making decisions, taking action, and protecting herself. As the sun began to rise outside my kitchen window, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, I pulled out the notebook where I had been tracking their suspicious behavior over the past weeks. I turned to a fresh page and wrote "My plan" at the top in bold letters. The first item I wrote down surprised me with its audacity. Remove them as emergency contacts everywhere. If they wanted to treat me like a burden they needed to manage from a distance, then perhaps it was time to relieve them of that responsibility entirely. If they thought I required professional oversight, then perhaps it was time to show them what professional boundaries actually looked like. I had been their safety net for decades. The person they called when crises struck, when decisions needed to be made, when life became complicated. I had dropped everything countless times to help them through divorces, job changes, health scares, and financial emergencies. I had been available without question, without resentment, without ever asking for reciprocal support. But safety nets work both ways. While I had been catching them when they fell, they had been my emergency contacts, my ICE listings, my designated decision makers in case of crisis. If they no longer saw me as competent enough to live independently, then perhaps they weren't qualified to make decisions about my care if something happened to me. I spent the rest of Monday researching exactly how many institutions had my children listed as emergency contacts. The list was longer than I had expected. My bank, my insurance companies, my doctor's office, my dentist, my lawyer, my accountant, the veterinary clinic where I occasionally brought Mrs. Chen's cat, even my library system's emergency contact database. Each listing represented years of trust, of assuming that my children would act in my best interests if I were unable to advocate for myself. But their current behavior had shattered that assumption. How could I trust them to make medical decisions for me when they had already decided I was incapable of making housing decisions for myself? How could I rely on them to manage my affairs if something happened to me when they were already planning to manage my affairs while I was perfectly healthy? On Tuesday morning, I made my first call to First National Bank, where I had maintained accounts for over 20 years. The customer service representative was polite but puzzled when I requested to update my emergency contact information. "Is there a problem with your current contacts, Mrs. Williams?" she asked. "No problem," I said carefully. "I'm just updating my personal information to reflect some recent changes in my family situation." I replaced Michael's name and number with my neighbor Eleanor Chen's information. Eleanor was sharp, independent, and had no agenda regarding my living situation. More importantly, she saw me as a competent adult rather than a problem requiring intervention. The process was surprisingly simple. 20 minutes on the phone, a few security questions, and Michael was no longer authorized to access information about my accounts or make decisions on my behalf. It felt like removing a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Over the next 3 days, I methodically worked through my list. My insurance agent, Dr. Peterson's office, my financial advisor, one by one. I removed my children from their position of authority over my life and replaced them with people who respected my autonomy. Some calls required in-person visits to sign new forms. Others could be handled over the phone or through secure online portals. With each change, I felt stronger, more in control of my own destiny. I wasn't burning bridges or cutting ties. I was simply reclaiming the right to determine who would speak for me if I couldn't speak for myself. The most significant change came on Friday when I visited my lawyer, Margaret Foster, to update my will and advance directives. Margaret had handled Robert's estate after his death and had always treated me with respect and professionalism. When I explained that I wanted to make changes to my emergency contacts and healthcare proxies, she didn't question my mental competence or suggest that I discuss the changes with my children first. "It's your life, Patricia," she said simply. "These are your decisions to make." We spent 2 hours reviewing documents, updating instructions, and ensuring that my wishes were clearly stated and legally binding. I designated Eleanor Chen as my healthcare proxy and named my friend Carol as alternate decision-maker. Both women were sharp, trustworthy, and most importantly, they saw me as an equal, rather than a dependent. By the end of the week, my children were no longer listed as emergency contacts anywhere in my life. They had no access to my medical information, no authority over my finances, No legal standing to make decisions about my care. If something happened to me, they would be notified as family members, but they would not be in charge. The irony wasn't lost on me. In their effort to take control of my life, they had lost what control they actually had. In their attempt to protect me from imaginary dangers, they had forfeited their role as my protectors. In their rush to make decisions for me, they had eliminated their ability to make any decisions about me at all. But the most important change wasn't legal or financial. It was psychological. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. I felt competent, capable, and in charge of my own future. I had taken action instead of accepting other people's plans for my life. I had made choices instead of submitting to their choices for me. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after their Mother's Day intervention, I received a text from Jennifer, asking how I was adjusting to the idea of moving to Sunset Manor. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple, "We should talk." I was ready for that conversation now, not as the confused, overwhelmed woman they thought they had left in my living room, but as someone who had spent a week reclaiming her life and discovering exactly how much power she still possessed. They wanted to manage my future. They were about to learn that my future was no longer theirs to manage. Pre-main. They thought I needed their protection. They were about to discover that I had already found more reliable protectors. They believed I was too fragile to make my own decisions. They were about to see just how decisive I could be when my autonomy was threatened. The woman they thought required their intervention had just demonstrated that she was perfectly capable of intervening on her own behalf. And this was only the beginning. The family meeting I called for Sunday afternoon felt different from any gathering we had ever had. For once, I was the one setting the agenda, choosing the time and place, and controlling the flow of information. They arrived at my house with the same concerned expressions they had worn the previous week, but this time, I was ready for them. I had spent Saturday preparing, not just emotionally, but practically. I printed copies of every document I had updated, organized them in neat folders with each child's name on the front. I wanted them to see exactly what decisive action looked like when it came from someone they had dismissed as needing management. "Thank you all for coming," I said as they settled into my living room, their eyes already scanning my face for signs of the breakdown they probably expected. "I asked you here because I have some important information to share about the decisions I've made this week." Michael leaned forward, his expression cautious but hopeful. "Have you thought more about Sunset Manor? Did you want to schedule that tour?" "No," I said simply. "I've made other arrangements." I handed each of them their folder and watched their faces as they opened them. The documents were straightforward. Copies of the forms I had filed, removing them as emergency contacts, the updated healthcare directives, the revised will provisions. Black and white evidence that the woman they thought needed their protection had been quite busy protecting herself. Jennifer looked up first, her face pale. "Mom, what is this?" "These are the changes I made to my emergency contact information this week," I explained calmly. "You're no longer listed as my primary contacts with any of my doctors, banks, insurance companies, or legal representatives." David's folder hit his lap like he had dropped it. You removed us? All of us?" "Yes, I replaced you with people who respect my autonomy and treat me as a competent adult." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael shuffled through his papers again, as if hoping the words would change upon rereading. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, though whether from hurt or frustration, I couldn't tell. "Mom," Michael's voice was carefully controlled, "this seems like an extreme reaction to our suggestion about assisted living. We were only trying to help." "Were you?" I pulled out my laptop and opened it to their email thread, the one they had accidentally sent me. "Because this doesn't read like helping. This reads like a detailed plan to relocate me against my will." I turned the screen toward them and watched their faces as they recognized their own words. The spreadsheets, the timelines, the text messages analyzing my mental competence. The clinical way they had discussed selling my house and managing my money. The casual dismissal of my preferences in favor of their convenience. "You researched assisted living facilities without me," I continued, my voice steady. "You contacted moving companies without me. You consulted lawyers about power of attorney without me. You made deposits and signed contracts without me. At what point in this process did you plan to treat me like a person instead of a problem? Jennifer was crying openly now. We never meant to hurt you. We were scared. Scared of what, exactly? Of something happening to you, David said quietly. Of getting a call that you'd fallen, or had a heart attack, or couldn't take care of yourself anymore. We thought if we planned ahead. You thought if you planned my entire future without consulting me, you'd feel better about your own lives, I finished. You decided that your peace of mind was more important than my autonomy. Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated. So what now? You're cutting us out of your life completely? I'm setting boundaries, I corrected. There's a difference. You're still my children, and I still love you. But you're no longer in charge of my life. Because you've demonstrated that you can't be trusted with that responsibility. I pulled out another set of documents. The research I had done about Sunset Manor, the financial analysis of their plan, the legal implications of what they had tried to orchestrate. Did you know, I said, spreading the papers on my coffee table, that once someone moves into assisted living, it becomes much more difficult to leave? Did you know that the contracts you were so eager to sign on my behalf include clauses about cognitive evaluation and family override of resident preferences? Their faces told me they hadn't considered these details. They had been so focused on solving their problem, their worry about me, that they hadn't considered what their solution would actually mean for my life. You weren't just planning to move me, I continued. You were planning to trap me in a system designed to keep people safe by removing their choices. You were willing to sacrifice my freedom for your comfort. That's not. Jennifer started, then stopped. We never thought of it that way. Of course you didn't. Because you weren't thinking about it from my perspective at all. You were thinking about it from yours. What would make you feel better? What would be more convenient for you? What would eliminate your worry about me? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I had planted, the bird feeder I filled every morning, the neighborhood where I had built relationships and routines that mattered to me. I'm 58 years old, I said without turning around. I'm healthy, financially stable, and mentally sharp. I live in a house I love, in a community where I have friends and purpose. I garden, I read, I volunteer at the library, I take long walks, and I solve my own problems. I am not a burden that needs managing. When I turned back to face them, Michael was staring at his hands, Jennifer was wiping her eyes, and David looked like he was struggling to process everything I had said. But that's how you see me, I continued, as someone whose judgment can't be trusted, whose preferences don't matter, whose life is yours to organize. You see a problem where I see a life worth living. We just wanted to protect you, David said quietly. From what? From living independently? From making my own choices? From experiencing the natural risks that come with being human? I sat back down across from them. You wanted to protect yourselves from the discomfort of worrying about me. I picked up the folder containing their Sunset Manor research and held it up. Do you know what this represents? This represents months of your time and energy spent planning my future without including me in the conversation. Months of treating me like I was already incompetent, already someone who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. We never said you were incompetent, Michael protested. You didn't have to say it, your actions said it for you. I opened to a page in their research showing the facility's memory care unit. You even researched what would happen when my mind started to go. You planned for my decline before there was any evidence of it occurring. The weight of their betrayal settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These were my children, the people I had raised to be thoughtful and compassionate, and they had spent months treating me like a dependent who couldn't be trusted with basic life decisions. So what happens now? Jennifer asked, her voice small. Now you live with the consequences of your choices, I said. You wanted to remove me from the position of being your safety net? Congratulations. You're no longer mine either. I pulled out the final document, a letter I had written to each of them, explaining exactly what my new boundaries looked like. If you have medical emergencies, call 911. If you need financial help, call a bank. If you need advice about major life decisions, Call a therapist or a trusted friend. I am no longer available to drop everything and rescue you from the consequences of your choices." Michael's face had gone pale. "Mom, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You demonstrated that you don't value my judgment or respect my autonomy. Why would I want people with that attitude making decisions about my life if something happens to me?" I looked at each of them in turn. These adults I had raised, loved, supported through every crisis, and celebrated through every triumph. They had repaid my devotion by deciding I was no longer competent to manage my own life. "You wanted to treat me like someone who needed professional management instead of family support," I said. "So I've arranged for professional management. Eleanor Chen is my new healthcare proxy. My lawyer Margaret Foster is my executor. My financial advisor has instructions about my wishes if I become incapacitated." "You're punishing us," David said, his voice tight with emotion. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting myself. Just like you thought you were protecting me, except I'm doing it with my full knowledge and consent." The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of relationships that had fundamentally changed. They had come here expecting to comfort me through my adjustment period, to guide me toward accepting their vision of my future. Instead, they were discovering that the future they had planned was no longer possible. "I need you to leave now," I said finally. "I need time to decide what kind of relationship we can have going forward, if any." As they gathered their folders and prepared to go, Jennifer turned back at the door. "We love you, Mom." "I know you do," I replied, "but love without respect isn't enough anymore." After they left, I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by the life I had fought to keep. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt peaceful rather than ominous. I had taken action, set boundaries, and reclaimed control of my destiny. They would probably spend the evening discussing my overreaction, analyzing my mental state, and strategizing about how to handle this unexpected development. But that was their problem now, not mine. I had work to do, a life to live, choices to make, and a future to create that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I was standing in my kitchen making Thanksgiving dinner when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Jennifer's number, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Our relationship had been reduced to careful, infrequent conversations since that Sunday confrontation, each of us testing the boundaries of this new dynamic we had created. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was tentative, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "I know we haven't talked much lately, but I wanted to call before Thursday." Thursday was Thanksgiving, a holiday that had become complicated for our family since my declaration of independence. The traditional gathering at my house was no longer automatic, no longer assumed. Everything had to be negotiated now, discussed rather than taken for granted. "I'm glad you called," I said, and I meant it. The anger that had sustained me through those first difficult weeks had mellowed into something more sustainable. Not forgiveness exactly, but an acceptance that relationships can survive fundamental changes if both sides are willing to adapt. "I wanted to ask," Jennifer paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Would you like company for Thanksgiving? I know David is going to Kansas City with friends, and Michael's staying in Denver this year, but I could drive down from Portland if you'd like." The offer surprised me. Since our confrontation, my children had been treating me with a mixture of wariness and wounded dignity, as if I had violated some unspoken contract by refusing to accept their management of my life. This was the first time any of them had reached out with something that felt like genuine care rather than obligation. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's a long drive, and I don't want you to feel like you have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "If you'll have me." "I miss you, Mom." I looked around my kitchen, seeing it with fresh eyes. The counters were covered with the familiar chaos of holiday preparation, flour dusting every surface, mixing bowls stacked in the sink, the scent of sage and thyme floating through the air. This was my space, my rhythm, my choice about how to spend the holiday, but it didn't have to be solitary. "I'd like that," I said, "but I should probably warn you. Things are different now." "I know," Jennifer said quietly. "I'm hoping we can figure out what different looks like." She arrived Wednesday evening with a bottle of wine, and a humility I had never seen in her before. We moved around each other carefully in the kitchen, relearning how to be together without the old assumptions about who was responsible for whom. She didn't try to take over the cooking, didn't suggest I was doing too much or working too hard. She simply asked how she could help and followed my lead. During dinner on Thursday, something shifted between us. Maybe it was the wine, or the comfort of old traditions, or simply the passage of enough time for wounds to begin healing. Jennifer started talking about her life in Portland, not the sanitized version she usually shared, but the real struggles and disappointments and small victories that made up her daily existence. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she admitted as we lingered over dessert. "About love without respect not being enough." I waited, letting her find her own words. "I think we got so caught up in our own fears that we forgot you're still you. Still the person who raised us to be independent and make our own choices. We somehow convinced ourselves that those rules didn't apply to you anymore." "What changed your mind?" I asked. Jennifer smiled ruefully. "A few things. Partly it was talking to my therapist about family dynamics. But mostly it was watching how you handled our intervention. The way you researched everything, made strategic decisions, set boundaries. That's not someone who needs managing. That's someone who knows exactly how to manage herself." She paused, twirling her wineglass between her hands. "I kept waiting for you to fall apart after we left that day. I thought you'd call crying, or show up at David's apartment, or do something that proved you really did need us to take care of you. Instead, you did the exact opposite. You took care of yourself better than we ever could have." I thought about those first weeks after our confrontation, when I had indeed felt lost and heartbroken, but I hadn't called them for comfort or guidance. I had worked through my grief with Eleanor Chen over coffee, processed my anger during long walks with Mrs. Patterson from down the street, found my footing again through my own resources and the support of people who saw me as I actually was rather than as they feared I might become. It wasn't easy, I admitted, but it was necessary. "Michael's having the hardest time with it," Jennifer continued. "He keeps saying we were just trying to be responsible, that we couldn't live with ourselves if something happened to you, and we hadn't done everything possible to prevent it. And what do you think about that?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, staring out my kitchen window at the bare November trees. "I think we were trying to be responsible for the wrong things. We were taking responsibility for outcomes we can't control, instead of taking responsibility for how we treat you." This was the conversation I had been hoping to have for months. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that something fundamental had been wrong with their approach. An understanding that good intentions don't excuse disrespectful actions. "I need you to know," Jennifer said, looking directly at me, "that I understand now why you did what you did. Changing the emergency contacts, setting boundaries, all of it. You weren't punishing us. You were protecting yourself from people who had stopped seeing you clearly." Over the weekend, as Jennifer helped me put away Thanksgiving decorations and prepare the house for winter, we began negotiating what our relationship might look like going forward. It was awkward at first, like learning a new language after decades of speaking in familiar patterns. "I miss being able to call you when things go wrong," she admitted, while we were raking leaves in the backyard. "You can still call me," I said, "but not as someone who expects me to drop everything and fix your problems. Call me as someone who wants to talk through challenges with a person who cares about you." "What's the difference?" "The difference is assuming I have wisdom to offer rather than assuming I have obligations to fulfill." She leaned on her rake, considering this. "So you'd still give advice, but you wouldn't necessarily jump in a car and drive to Portland to solve whatever crisis I'm having?" "Exactly. I might offer suggestions or listen while you work through your options, or help you think about consequences. But I wouldn't take responsibility for fixing your life, and you wouldn't expect me to." As she prepared to leave Sunday morning, Jennifer hugged me at the front door with something that felt like the beginning of respect. "I love you, Mom," she said. "And I think I'm finally starting to love you the right way." In the months that followed, my relationships with all three of my children slowly evolved. David was the next to reach out, calling one evening in January to tell me about a promotion at work. The conversation was different from our old pattern. He shared his news not because he needed my approval or validation, but because he wanted someone who had known him his entire life to celebrate with him. Michael took longer to adjust. He called sporadically, usually with updates about the twins or Amanda's career, but there was a stiffness to our interactions that hadn't existed before. I sensed he was still struggling with the loss of his role as the responsible eldest child, the one who looked after everyone else's welfare. But even Michael began to soften when spring arrived, and he realized I had not only survived my winter of independence but thrived in it. I had taken a part-time job at the local historical society, started a book club with several neighbors, and signed up for watercolor classes at the community center. My life had expanded rather than contracted, filled with new relationships and activities that had nothing to do with managing family crises. "You seem happy," he said during one of our phone calls, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I am happy," I replied. "It turns out that being treated like a competent adult is good for my mental health." Eleanor Chen, my new healthcare proxy, became not just a safety net but a genuine friend. We walked together most mornings, sharing coffee and conversation about everything from neighborhood gossip to national politics. She never looked at me with the careful assessment my children had developed, never monitored my words for signs of decline. She simply enjoyed my company and assumed I would continue to be interesting and capable indefinitely. The greatest gift of my new independence was the discovery that I didn't need my children's protection to feel secure. I had built a network of relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, created routines that brought me joy rather than simply filled time, and established a life that belonged entirely to me. On Mother's Day of the following year, exactly 12 months after the day that changed everything, I received 3 cards in the mail. Not flowers, not phone calls suggesting elaborate plans, not guilt-laden visits designed to prove their devotion. Just cards, each with a handwritten note acknowledging that they were still learning how to love me without trying to control me. Jennifer's card was the most honest. "Thank you for teaching us that respect is not optional in a loving relationship. Thank you for showing us that protecting someone sometimes means stepping back rather than stepping in. Thank you for refusing to let our fear diminish your life." I sat on my back porch that morning, surrounded by the garden I had expanded and the bird feeders I had repositioned, reading their words and feeling something I hadn't expected: hope. Not for a return to the old dynamics, but for the possibility of something better. Relationships built on who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. The woman who had been told she needed management had become the teacher of a harder lesson: that love without autonomy is not love at all, but a comfortable form of imprisonment. That protecting someone from life's natural risks often means robbing them of life's natural dignity. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is to refuse to let them love you on their terms instead of your own. I was still their mother, but I was no longer their responsibility. I was still their emergency contact in matters of the heart, but no longer their emergency contact in matters of law and medicine. I was still someone they could turn to for wisdom and support, but no longer someone they could turn to for rescue and management. And in that careful renegotiation of roles and boundaries, we had all discovered something valuable: that real love grows stronger when it's rooted in respect, and that the best way to honor someone's life is to trust them to live it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.